Okay. Is everyone ready? At the onset of the 2008 recession, millions of Americans had to go home and tell their family that they couldn't put food on the table that evening. As layoffs increased, purchasing power went down, and millions of people fell into poverty. As the United States did what it could to stay afloat, this recession tested the resilience of the American people, the American economy, and ultimately the American spirit. We made it through the last time, but implementing a universal basic income would change this country, and it's not for the better. We wouldn't be ready to escape a recession. We would only be inviting one now. For this reason, we're proud to negate the resolution resolved. The United States should replace means-tested welfare programs with a universal basic income. For clarity, a means-tested welfare is the current system we have now, and a UBI or universal basic income is the idea that we give $1,000 per month to all citizens every month. There are 3 reasons you should vote negative in this round. A is inflation. As Pharrell 19 finds that currently, the U.S. has struck the perfect level of inflation, around 2%, but things could really easily change. As Archetto finds in 2018, that a UBI would trigger an upwards inflationary spiral. As 1, we have to print money to implement the UBI. But 2, companies know that everyone has more income to spend, which will raise the price of goods, both triggering high inflation and pushing us into a recession. As Richter finds that this is historically proven, as inflation has directly caused the last 4 recessions in history and indirectly caused things like the lending crisis in 2007, because in times of inflation, banks turn to risky and unsafe practices. Ultimately, preventing a recession and the ability to recover quickly, mitigate the severity of a recession will be key, as the IMF finds that the next full-blown U.S. recession could potentially go global, and given how interconnected the global economy is now, it would likely push 900 million people into poverty almost instantaneously. But the second reason you vote for us is high cost. As Lori 18 finds that in the case that the U.S. were to approve the UBI of $1,000 per month, it would cost over $3.9 trillion per year. Or that's 1/5 of the American economy. Imagine this: the military, infrastructure, social services, and the U.S. criminal justice system all become combined. That's how much it would take to fund it, as he concludes that there's no way to get enough in taxes, and even taking the money from every billionaire living in the United States, it wouldn't be sufficient to pay it off, so the U.S. would be forced to spend a deficit. And cutting social programs wouldn't be enough. As Rector 18 finds, the U.S. spending on means-tested welfare was only $829 billion in a single year. For this reason, UPenn finds that a UBI of only half of what's advocated for now would be funded in deficit and would increase the federal debt by 81% over the next 10 years, further dropping the GDP by a tragic 9%. Tragically, Tully 18 finds that high debt constrains our ability to recover from economic downturns, as increasingly high interest payments on debt crowd out the ability to pass stimulus packages. As Stone finds that absent financial stimulus packages, downturns would be twice as long with twice as much unemployment. But the third reason you vote for us is the death of welfare. As Sherman finds that means-tested welfare programs has successfully prevented an additional 40 million people from falling into poverty each and every year, and has long-term educational, health, and positive employment impacts on adults and children and people with disabilities. Despite criticism from the right, Greenstein 18 finds that administrative costs only take up 1% of overall welfare spending, and the majority of the benefits go to the people. For instance, Carlson in 2018 finds that SNAP, the federal food aid program, has kept 42 million people from starvation, reducing nationwide food insecurity by 30%. But affirming would reverse all these good policies and would kick millions of people off the benefits, making them reliant on a UBI as their savior. As a UBI in the United States would only serve to increase poverty and inequality, as Greenstein finds that it cuts means-tested welfare in favor of a UBI and will only serve to redistribute the wealth up the income bracket because it takes money specifically targeted at the bottom fifth and spreads it across the entire population. As Greenstein concludes that tens of millions will fall back into the poverty with the UBI the AF prescribes, and in social programs in 2017 alone decreased poverty 44%, the people would otherwise be poor, and the UBI would only take away money from said programs.
As a brief warning before we begin our case discusses issues like domestic violence and things like that. So if anyone has an issue with those arguments, we will be happy to switch them out as long as they message us on like Facebook Messenger. Just search up our names. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay. Time starts now. We affirm contention 1 is ending intimate partner violence. AP 19 explains that a majority of women have faced abusive relationships. 70% of millennial women have experienced financial abuse by a romantic partner. 1 in 4 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Financial abuse prevents abuse victims from leaving the relationship. Fisk 18 writes that 1 in 5 women interviewed said that they could not leave an abusive relationship because they had no money of their own. A UBI would solve by giving women their own source of unconditional income, giving them more financial independence. The impact is alleviating domestic violence. This empirically occurred in Kenya, as Anzalotti 19 writes that the presence of a basic income correlated with significant declines in rates of violence. In households where women received cash transfers, the number of women who reported being kicked, dragged, or beaten by their husbands fell by 51%. Incidences of forced sexual acts declined as much as 66%. The decline could reflect the fact that the extra payments gave women more leverage to either resist sexual violence or leave the relationship. Contention 2 is an unfair welfare state. The welfare system fundamentally disadvantages minorities in 2 different ways. First is stringent conditions. It is much harder for people of color to qualify for welfare. Murillo 16 explains that 63% of those in welfare programs with the most harsh conditions were black, and 29% were white. In other words, a dollar in welfare has 3 to 5 times as many strings for someone who is black than someone who is white. Second is decentralization. Samuel 17 indicates that the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, is a welfare program implemented by giving individual states grants to spend however they want. This overlooks people of color. Allowing states to decide how to spend TANF has led to racial discrepancies in who receives benefits. States whose populations are more heavily African American are less generous, more restrictive, and provide TANF for a shorter period of time than wider states. About 56% of the country's African Americans live in the 25 states that rank the lowest on the TANF to poverty ratio, as opposed to 46% of white people. Allowing for local discretion as to who can receive benefits has continually led to African American families receiving less or getting tossed off the rolls altogether. This is dangerous because according to Parolin in 2019, racial inequalities in the state's administration of the TANF program contributed to the impoverishment of approximately 256,000 black children per year since 2012 to 2014. Ultimately, McFarland 16 explains that a universal basic income alleviates structural racism because it is uniformly administered and does not have unfair requirements. A UBI would be an improvement on today's current safety net. Benefits such as food stamps are replete with paternalistic restrictions that rest on racist tropes about recipients and their consumption habits. Others are significantly tied to work, which is problematic when racism continues to create so many barriers to black employment. UBI lacks these flaws. Contention 3 is economic growth. Gibson 20 explains that 38.1 million people are living in poverty, with an additional 93 million more living close to poverty. Overall, Mason 17 quantifies that the recovery from the Great Recession has been slow. Historically, every time that a recession has reduced our GDP, it has been followed by a period of faster than usual growth. Since 2007, however, there's been no tendency to make up the ground that was lost during the recession. On the contrary, the gap between per capita GDP and the pre-recession trend has steadily increased, reaching 15%. Luckily, Brown 17 writes that money from a UBI would circulate throughout the economy at a fast pace. When the government invests into the economy, that money recirculates again and again. So not only does it create jobs once, but the investment creates jobs multiple times. The economy grows by a multitude of the initial spending, and the money issued by the government will return to them through an increase in fiscal revenues generated by the UBI itself. This is due to the velocity of money, the number of times a dollar is traded in a year. The impact is economic growth. Matthew 17, it quantifies the positive effect of UBI. The $12,000 per year per adult would permanently grow the economy by 13.1%, or about $2.5 trillion come 2025. This will also increase the amount of Americans with jobs by about 2%, which expands the labor force by the tune of 4.7 million people. For all these reasons, please affirm.
Can I just see like the 2 links on racial inequality?
Yeah. They're right here. So the first one is the top one.
Pulling up.
Okay. Sorry. We should call it 20 seconds. I forgot to start it in the first part.
Okay. Are you sure? 50 seconds? Are you sure it's 50?
We can call it like
It's
30
fine.
and go into it.
Okay, whatever.
Alright.
Hold up.
Alright.
Done.
Okay, so let's go to this contention about racial inequality. Aside from the numbers being that like there's more black people and like really harsh condition welfare programs, what's the reason as to like why there's like such a disparity rather than just like general racism?
Well, the states have the ability to implement these welfare programs however they want.
Sure.
The difference from a UBI is that welfare programs don't have a specific way that you have to implement the welfare program.
Sure.
I mean, states can use
I
that
get
to like
there's
get away
like
with.
conditions, right? That like conditions that like like target black people,
No.
so or that target people of color per se,
Mm.
or you're basically just saying that like the fact that there's conditions like isolate certain groups and that because a UBI doesn't have certain conditions, it's better. But what's the conditions in themselves? Like what are the conditions that are like isolating these groups?
Well, like for example, in the example of TAN,
Yeah.
like the impact card,
Mhm.
it basically talks about how for black families, instead of actually giving them the money, they just recommend them to marriage counseling or things like that, where they just give them a $4 brochure instead of actually giving them money. And that's because like these states are not implementing the welfare programs like in the ways that they're like supposed to, because the law doesn't actually indicate that they have to give the money, and they just use those loopholes to
But
get
if,
away
if,
with not
if,
giving
if
the
it's
money.
the state who's implementing it wrong, doesn't that mean they can do the same thing under a UBI?
No.
They could just implement it wrong?
Because a UBI would be very clear. It just says that you have to give $1,000 to a
Yeah,
person
but-
per month.
but
And
you're
that, there's
saying-
no way that the state
Yeah.
can just like fudge that law, because it's a very clear
Well,
law.
I mean, we put in welfare thinking it was a good idea, and then you said, well, it was
Well-
just the state who did it wrong. So it's not the issue with the program, but the issue with the actor themselves.
Well, unless you can indicate to me that like they will be able to create a UBI that's like unclear, then you can't really get access to that.
I mean, it's
I
the
can have
same
a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let's talk about how they're going to print money. When has
Okay.
this ever historically happened in the USA?
That they print money,
Yeah.
like every day. That's what the reserve is.
No, like print money to like spend more.
Like every cycle. Because like as people increase in the population, like you have to print money. Like that's a really vague question.
Okay, when have they ever had to print trillions of dollars? Like when has the USA ever printed trillions of dollars at the same
So
time?
in the 07 lending crisis, the Federal Reserve printed $4 trillion and injected it in the economy.
Well, they injected it slowly, like over periods
That's
of time.
not true. It like happened under a year. And then 08 happened.
Okay.
And we went into a recession.
Okay.
Okay. So let's go to like this economic growth contention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually no. Let's go to your domestic violence contention, right?
Yeah.
You say like in Kenyan villages, like I don't know, like it's a small Kenyan village, you give people extra income and then they're able to like leave abusive relationships.
Yeah.
How can we compare like small Kenyan villages with like 20 people in them to the entire United States?
Well, we would say that it gives them more financial flexibility. For example, you can like rent out a motel or things like that while you're trying to go through like divorce proceedings
Wait.
or things like that.
But like a small Kenyan village, the people have no starting income. Like they could literally be making $0 or $2
Well,
a day.
in the Kenyan
so I think
vil-
$500
the
a day
problem-
is a bigger difference
Yeah, the
than like
prob-
what we have now, where
the
people
prob-
have like actual
Yeah.
incomes.
The problem with your analysis is that it assumes that we're giving $1,000 to a Kenyan village. It was like proportional to the Kenyan village, the amount of money that was given.
Okay. Can I see like what the proportion was?
Yeah, I can just give you the study.
Hi.
Here, I'll just open the whole thing. Yeah, you can just check the methodology right.
It's on the table so you can see it. Can you just like, is it the ends only?
Yeah, it's ends on.
Yeah, I cut that. Okay. No, that matters. Alright,
We'll just run prep from 25 seconds. Alright, okay, so that's 55 seconds used total. Yeah, so
So it's just going to be an overall argument addressing their entire case as a whole, and then just on their contentions, one by one. Alright. Everybody okay? As an overall argument, Larkin 19 explains that a UBI would cause the market to adjust accordingly to the policy, and the price of everything would move upwards accordingly. This means that, in fact, no real benefit is achieved for those economically suffering to begin with, and would not actually cause any benefits to growth. In fact, Alexander 17 explains that a UBI would destroy the economy by igniting hyperinflation and crushing growth, causing stagflation. It would cause low employment and high prices. Wages will have to increase to incentivize people to stay in the labor force. What ends up happening is that this would erode the purchasing power of the UBI payment, and this cycle renders the income guarantee self-defeating and will end up not only canceling the positive effects of the UBI, but also would result in an actual negative. This means that all that ends up happening when you implement the UBI is that you get rid of welfare, but you don't replace it with anything substantial because inflation just causes all benefits to be reversed. But now let's talk about their IPV argument specifically. The biggest problem here is that Davenport 20 explains that the biggest reason why survivors stay in abusive relationships in the first place is because of their fear of their abuser. Importantly, IPV does not stop once survivors get out of the relationship, as over 70% of IPV injuries happen after the victim has already left the relationship. Survivors fear the safety for themselves, their children, and their family, so staying in the relationship feels like the only alternative. Giving them financial mobility does not change that. But second, NNEDV 17 explains that a UBI does not stop the abuser from just stealing the UBI from their partner, as this is literally what is happening now and why people don't have financial mobility. Abusers gain financial control over their partners by controlling joint bank accounts, which means that people in abusive relationships actually would not necessarily be able to use their UBI to even get out of it. But third and finally, Belotra 20 explains that statistically, opportunities for survivors to gain more financial mobility actually ends up causing more IPV because it threatens gender stereotypes, leading to backlash from psychological and financial stress. Abusers try to reassert their authority in the face of new opportunities for survivors by using more violence. What you end up seeing is that by giving survivors more opportunities, you're actually causing more violence against them. But next, go to their welfare argument, which is their second contention. The best way to solve this problem is through limiting spending and evading a recession, because economic downturns always get scapegoated on minorities, and they actually feel the effects the worst. If purchasing power goes down, then minorities are affected overall as well. But second, at the point where a UBI would end up being self-defeating and inflation would stop its benefits, you see that you end up leaving minorities even worse off than they're starting now, because instead of receiving the little help that they're receiving now, they would be receiving nothing at all. But even further, despite the optimistic literature that tries to explain how UBI being implemented could reduce the levels of systemic racism, Self 16 points out that they all gloss over one of the most important questions: what happens to immigrants? The immigrants who don't receive a UBI because of their illegal status actually create an underclass of migrant workers who will be forced to work for less, driving wages down across the board. Not only would such a policy produce more racist discourse and encourage a fear of migrants stealing our money, the UBI would aid in the further exploitation of migrant workers in rich nations. What ends up happening is that even if you believe what they're telling you and that a UBI would somehow fix racism against black people in the United States, you just see that racism increases against another minority group. The best way to target oppression overall for all groups is to help save the economy as a whole. The only side that does that is us. But on their final argument about boosting the economy, remember our entire case, which gives you several reasons why implementing a UBI would be counterintuitive in solving the economy, as you actually end up seeing you cause a global recession, pushing 900 million people into poverty. But even further, Zon 16 explains that replacing the safety net with a UBI would disregard the specific parts of it that are designed to replace income, such as employment insurance, pensions, and disability insurance programs. These gaps would not be well served by a UBI, and this is why a UBI would leave many people worse off. Specifically, as Roddy 19 explains that over 41 million people rely on the guiding aspects of welfare, such as drug tests and home visits, in order to make financially stable decisions. A no-strings UBI would cut those people off from making good decisions critical to their survival, because we help the American people vote in.
Okay, we'll run a little prep time.
Absolutely.
Now. That's sorry. We'll keep going. That was a minute 11, sorry. Okay, so first I'm going to respond to their case, and then I'll go back to defend my own case. Is everyone good? Cool. Oh, my phone's at 3%, actually. Can I use your phone to type? Okay. Time starts now. Their first main argument is about how a UBI would increase inflation. There's a few responses to this. First, Stanton finds in 2020 that a UBI wouldn't increase inflation, and there's a few reasons for this. A, he finds that even when the Federal Reserve did something called quantitative easing, where they pumped $4 trillion of printed money into the economy, there wasn't an increase in inflation, which proves that a UBI similarly wouldn't cause the same thing. And second, he finds that in UBI experiments in places like Alaska and Kuwait, there was actually no increase in inflation. In fact, inflation actually went down, which empirically proves that there's not going to be an increase in inflation. The reason why this happens is because Brown 17 finds that the US economy is running under capacity. So even if you inject trillions of dollars into the economy, it doesn't cause inflation, it just helps the economy get better. Then, go to their subpoint B. They talk about how the UBI would cost a lot and how it makes it harder for the United States to pass stimulus packages during times of recession. There's three main responses. First comes from Fuchsman in 2019, who finds that a UBI wouldn't cost trillions of dollars like they say. It would actually cost about $539 billion, which is comparable to about how much we're spending on welfare right now. The reason why is because he finds that when you increase tax revenues by growing the economy and you have a lot of rich people spending taxes into the government funds, that actually offsets a lot of the cost of the UBI, so it's not as much as they say, which means debt doesn't go up a lot like they say it does. Second, we would say that it doesn't have to be just debt that we finance the UBI with. For example, Andrew Yang has proposed something called the value-added tax, which is a way to raise revenue for the UBI without actually going into debt. So they need to prove why debt is the only way that a UBI would actually be financed. There's other ways that it could happen, and they wouldn't have any negative harms for that. And third, their impact on this argument is that if you have a lot of debt, you can't pass stimulus packages to help the economy get better. But the problem is, right now in 2020, the debt to GDP ratio in the US is already 100%. So the US already has literally over $20 trillion of debt. So they need to explain why right now, even now, the US has so much debt that they could probably never pass another stimulus package anyway. Even if debt goes up a little bit more, that's not going to change the fact that the US has so much debt, they would not be able to pass a stimulus package in both worlds. Then, go to the subpoint C. They talk about the death of welfare and how it prevents people from falling into poverty. Four responses. First, Tracy 19 finds that 1/4 of people that are poor in America don't get access to welfare, and 1/3 of the most poor in America actually don't receive welfare either. And the reason why is because there are a ton of restrictions that prevent people from accessing welfare on a regular basis. So we would say that you should just give money to everybody through a UBI and ensure that no one falls through the cracks of these welfare programs. Second, we would say that when you have welfare programs, that traps people in poverty. And that's because when you go above a certain income, you lose access to welfare benefits. So either A, if they start to get a job and work more, they're going to lose all their welfare benefits and be stuck in poverty. Or B, they try to keep their welfare benefits by not working as much, and then they still end up stuck in poverty. Either way, welfare traps people in cyclical poverty. A better thing to do would just give a UBI to everybody, regardless of what their income is. Third, they talk about SNAP and food stamps, but the Urban Institute finds that even with maximum SNAP food stamps benefits, that can't cover the cost of a low-income meal in 99% of US counties, which means that these SNAP benefits aren't actually that beneficial. Then fourth, Chanel 19 finds that Trump is actually trying to take actions to cut the eligibility for food stamps. He's literally kicking off 700,000 people from being eligible to get food stamps, which means that a UBI, which would go to everybody, would definitely help a lot more people than SNAP would. Then go to our case. They read an overarching argument at the top about how prices would, hyperinflation would happen. First, we already responded to their inflation argument, but second, they don't prove why a UBI couldn't just be adjusted for inflation over time. For example, the minimum wage is raised every few years because inflation happens. A similar thing could happen with the UBI, so it keeps giving people purchasing power. Then, go to our second contention. They say first that if there's economic downturns, then it causes scapegoating of minorities. We already responded to the recession argument, but even if you buy that argument, before the recession ever happens, we're proving that right now, the welfare state traps people who are people of color in cyclical poverty, which means that their argument doesn't actually make anything worse. Then they talk about inflation, which we already responded to, and third, they talk about immigrants, because 16 finds that most immigrants, there's a bunch of restrictions that make it very hard for them to get welfare. Trump literally just passed a rule that said that if an immigrant was likely to use welfare, they would be denied their green card application, which means that immigrants can't get benefits in either world. It's not an argument you can vote for on either side. We'll talk about the third contention later. Okay, so vote F. And you have the first question.
Yeah. So, okay. Let's talk about our second subpoint about the high cost. You say that it would actually only end up costing $600 billion. Why is this?
539 billion. And the reason why is because A, when the UBI stimulates the economy, there's more tax revenues coming in from like income taxes, sales taxes, etc., which often pays for the UBI.
So-
and then second, because a lot of rich people, for example, like Bill Gates, pay a lot more money into the UBI than they get out, which means that the overall cost of the UBI is lower than you say.
So it's because rich people pay more money into like the economy.
No, there's two reasons. The first one is that when the economy is like getting better and there's more transactions being made, people are working more, there's higher income taxes, etc., more taxes go into the government
so
to pay
it's
for
just
the
a
UBI.
blanket, like people
And the
are
second thing-
people are taxed more.
No,
So,
the first- okay, the
but
first
I guess
argument-
I'm confused as to why a UBI would be taxed.
That's not what
because-
our argument is.
But
First,
so then why is there any change in tax revenue?
yeah, so just let me explain. When the economy does better, tax revenues go up because, income taxes, for example, when you work more, you pay more in income taxes to the government. When you buy more goods, you pay more in sales taxes to the government.
So
that's the first thing. The second thing
So
is that
I guess that gets
sure.
back to like the root of what you're saying. How does the economy get better?
well, that's our third contention, right? It
Yeah,
talks
but
about
you don't
how.
respond to the defense that I already put.
Well, yeah, Rohit's gonna talk about that later, but if you want, we can talk about it now. And the second thing that you didn't let me say was that a lot of people who are like millionaires and billionaires pay a lot more into the economy in their
Okay.
just general income taxes
Yeah.
than they would get back in a UBI.
So our
Can I get a question now?
Lowry evidence is pretty explicit in saying that like even if we took every dollar that billionaires have in the United States economy, it would not come close to paying for the UBI, right? So at that point, like
Well, no.
how much money exactly are we getting from taxes, right? How much like there's like just not a feasible way that
I
we
think-
get $3.5
yeah.
trillion from taxes.
Yeah, I understand that. So, like, the way that you get this $3 trillion number is you just, like, take the number of people in the US and just multiply it by $1,000 a month. And that's a bit of an oversimplification.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Like, that's not how the economy works. There's
Why?
other ways
Paying
that the government gets revenue.
$1,000 to every single
If you want, you
person
can call for the
in
fruits and evidence. Like, we spent 2 minutes on this, so can I get a question, please?
Yeah, sure. I
Thank
guess.
you. Okay, so let's talk about inflation, because you talk about that a lot. So,
I like it.
sure.
The argument.
Well, no, inflation's not good, but I guess,
argument.
okay.
I like
So,
the argument.
on the idea of inflation, right? Historically, has there been an example of any place that's done a UBI that has seen
Sure.
hyperinflation?
Finland, Norway, Denmark, India, Namibia. Do you want me to list more examples?
So, did any of these countries go into like a recession or anything?
Probably.
That seems kind of vague. Just give me one example. If you can't give me an example, your argument seems a little
I just gave
wishy-washy.
you like 5.
I'm saying, can you give me any example of a country that because they had a UBI
Sure.
saw hyperinflation
Well, like,
and then went
Not
into
a lot of
recession?
countries have actually implemented an
Well, you named like
entire
5 and it
UBI.
didn't happen in any of them. So
Yeah.
obviously your argument's not that
No,
great,
so
right?
like what you saw was like inflation increased. Not that like inflation happened to the point where it caused a recession. The reason why is because no country has really implemented a UBI to the scale that the United
Okay, well, that
United
answered my
States
question.
would.
Thank you.
Alright, thank you.
Okay, so that's 2 minutes and 20 seconds to use total.
The order for my speech is just going to be, I'm going to be talking about their cases and the responses they make, and then I'll go out and finish with our case. Okay. Is everyone ready? Let's start on the overarching response that Cooper reads you from Larkin. All they say to this, like that inflation is going to happen, hyperinflation will kill the economy because wages always increase in relation to the market and cause hyperinflation, meaning that the UBI defeats itself. All they say is that the Fed in the past tried to input money into the economy and it didn't cause the inflation. The reason why that happens is that a government institution wouldn't cause inflation on purpose. What the Fed was trying to do is different than what private companies are trying to do. When private companies increase prices because people have more money and can buy more goods, it's because they're greedy and want to make more money long term. The reason the government does things is to help their economy, so obviously they wouldn't cause inflation. That's just dumb. Let's just go down to the second part. They drop the Balochi evidence that Cooper reads you from IPV. Goes unresponded to, and this is where you can circle our names on your ballot. It says that over time, people's gender roles are re-entrenched because the head of the house wants to reassert their dominance, so they're immediately going to increase violence. So even if they can show that racism goes down long term, they can never quantify what racism actually means in the real world. But we can quantify that if violence goes up, more women are put at risk at death because they're being dragged, pushed, and hurt. But then let's go down the bottom on the contention 3. They never respond to anything Cooper tells you, as the Zahn and Riley evidence both tell you that independent programs like SNAP have saved 40 million people each year. So sure, even if the system isn't perfect, doesn't mean that we should shoot ourselves in the foot immediately. If you discontinue welfare programs, you discontinue SNAP. And that's not only in our case, but it's also in Cooper's speeches. And that tells you that's going to put 42 million people in poverty and likely at risk of starvation and death. But let's go to the top of our case. They read these inflation responses again. That just says that the Fed's quantitative easing didn't cause inflation. We're saying that it's not the Fed who's the actor, but rather private companies who are greedy and want to make more money because people have more income. But then they say it didn't happen in Alaska and Kuwait. But Alaska and Kuwait also didn't implement UPIs after the study was finished because they realized it's a really bad idea in the long term, and there's so many other negative implications of it that it was never a good idea. But then they say we're running under capacity. But just because the other shoe hasn't dropped doesn't mean that we should continue poking the bear. But then, on high costs, the Lowry evidence is really important. This is another place we easily win the round. They say that it's only going to cost $500 and something to implement a UBI. But the issue they miss is the Rector and UPenn evidence that tells you that even if it's cheap, the administration is always going to deficit spend. That's why over the next 8 years after a UBI is put in place, our federal debt is going to increase over 81% and our GDP is going to drop 10%. Meaning that even if people are making more money, they either can't spend it or the value of their money is increased or is decreased dramatically. That's why the IMF evidence tells you that in the next recession where 900 million people are pushed into poverty, their purchasing power goes down and they're pushed into extreme poverty. Meaning that even if these welfare programs are cheap to implement, they're not cheap to maintain. But also, you're going to vote for us on these SNAP programs because they read you a lot of reasons as to why the welfare system's imperfect. We're not saying it is perfect, but rather that when you take it away, you take away critical systems that are saving 40 million people each year. Without these systems in place, they won't be able to buy food, and that's why 42 million people immediately die once you pass their policies. At that point, it's a clear vote for us.
Okay. minute 45, so have 4 seconds left.
So they'll be down our case first, then their case. So everybody? Time starts now. At the top of our case, they keep trying to say that inflation is going to outpace the UBI and the UBI is not going to mean anything. But they drop the fact that the UBI itself could be indexed to inflation just like the minimum wage. Don't let them come here and make a new response in their final speech because that's unfair to us and it doesn't give us much time to respond. At that point, that goes cold conceded. That means the UBI will be able to be increased to account for inflation. And as a result, this means that the UBI will always maintain its value inside of the market, which means we get access to our impacts off of UBI. Then on our first argument, they try to extend this idea that, oh, people are going to reassert themselves and violence is going to increase. But they don't actually tell you what uniquely changes from a UBI from the welfare system. We would argue that a welfare system would do the exact same thing where it gives them financial independence. And there's no real offense for either side on this argument. There's no impact here. Then on our third contention, they just reassert a bunch of these same arguments about how 40 million people are saved from welfare. I'll get into that on their side. And they tried to say that, oh, there's a large amount of these programs that are forcing people to take drug tests and things like that. This argument is actually pretty offensive because it assumes that people who are in poverty, when you give them free money, are just going to spend it on drugs. That doesn't make a logical sense. They're going to be spending on things like food and education and things like that. Hence, a UBI would be really beneficial because they're going to be spending on things like food inside of the economy. And when they're spending more money inside of the economy, that's where you grant us our offense, because the Matthews evidence, which they don't respond to throughout the entire round, basically says that when you put more money to the economy, that money circulates throughout the entire economy. It creates jobs multiple times because people just start trading more. And as a result, because of this more trade, this increases the GDP by 13%. And as a result, that increases increases the amount of people who are employed by 4.7 million people. And as a result, if people are having a job, they don't actually care about welfare. They won't actually need to have welfare because they're going to be employed and move off of welfare, which means that our case outweighs them because it's a prerequisite. Now onto their case. On the top, they don't actually respond to a lot of the responses Vivian gives you. He just says a riddle in response to the Brown evidence. The Brown evidence is excellent because it explains that the economy is underproducing right now. Hence, if you inject a bunch of capital into the economy, it's not actually going to change anything because now they can just produce more to meet those new demands. As a result, inflation does not increase, and we give you two empirics from Alaska and Kuwait. We'd argue that these two empirics are better than any of those that they can give because their examples are small-scale experiments, whereas Alaska and Kuwait were the entire countries or the entire state were having a UBI, and we do not see inflation increase. Then, on their second argument about debt, they drop the Fuchsman evidence again because they just assert their UPenn evidence. The UPenn evidence is actually pretty terrible because it doesn't account for the fact that you're cutting welfare, which saves you a lot of money. And the Fuchsman's evidence does a better analysis because it explains that in the long term, because of tax revenues generated by the UBI creating economic growth, the cost of a UBI only goes down to $539 billion, which means that sure, at the start they may have to take on a little debt, but in the long term, because of the tax revenues, they're not actually going to take on that much more debt. And insofar the debt level is already at 100% right now, they don't tell you how much worse or how much harder it's going to get to borrow during a time of recession. They don't actually get access to the argument here. Then, on their third argument about how welfare is really important, it saves 40 million people, you could literally save 1/4 of the people who are not getting welfare right now. That's 13 million people who can get saved. And they drop the fact that SNAP is not effective in 99% of communities, counties. As a result, this means that they're funding a welfare system that is clearly failing and is not even affecting a majority of people. For all these reasons, you can see that it's clean from the background.
I have a question.
Sure.
Alright. Okay. So let's talk about SNAP. You tell me that SNAP is ineffective because it can't cover a low income meal, right?
Yeah.
So then why has food insecurity decreased by 30% and 42 million people have been prevented from starvation?
The economy has been growing, that's correlation.
Oh, so it's the economy's
Whoa.
fault.
When the inflation goes, we're not going in a recessionary path. That's when prices go down. When inflation happens, like we've been both talking about, prices go up, which means that food insecurity should have gone up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the problem with your argument.
What was your question?
Wait.
Yeah. I'm just confused as to how SNAP is not working when it is working. Because our evidence is really, really explicit in saying that SNAP is the reason why 42 million people have been able to
and we're
not
saying
starve
that's
to death.
necessarily a fake number or anything. Our argument is just that it's not nearly as effective as it could be, and the UBI could be a lot better.
Why is that true?
Because first, you don't respond to the Tracy evidence, which says that 1/4 of people in poverty in America can't even get SNAP. You can't even access
Sure,
benefits.
that's
and then
fine.
second,
But then- but
second, sorry, just
that-
to finish real quick.
Yeah, go
Second, that SNAP doesn't cover the cost of a low-income meal in literally 99% of America. So we're not saying that SNAP is bad or anything. It just could be a lot
Sure.
better through a UBI.
That's why a welfare state always solves better, because it's not like SNAP's the only program we have. there's like 40 something welfare programs. So like then they could go to an EITC, which is a wage subsidy program. So if you can't afford your meal on SNAP, then the government can just give you free money. Like,
Well, yeah,
again,
the EITC also has a lot of problems, and we would have talked about it if you mentioned it in your case. But
Well,
overall,
you can't
like,
with new welfare
Alright.
programs, just like
Or
pull
not.
it out
Okay.
in the last
I don't
speech.
have to.
He's just
They
giving
exist
you an
already.
example.
Yeah.
We're not going to talk about the EITC.
well, yeah, and I think
yet.
ultimately the Tracy
Alright.
evidence that you don't respond to still
Yeah,
stands,
got
that
it.
a lot of
I'm
people
sure
just
it
can't
does.
get welfare.
Right?
That's
Like
not
our
bad.
Greenstein
Yeah, I
evidence
would
that you
agree
don't
with that.
respond to also
Right.
still stands.
Yeah,
And
I
there's
mean,
13 million
I don't think
people
we
who
should just
don't.
leave 13 million people
Yeah,
just out
just
to
because
dry.
42 million people
Sure,
are
I don't-
unemployed doesn't mean you just
I'm
ignore
not
13
saying
million.
So okay. So if we ignore the, so I'm confused again because like you're saying that we're leaving the 13 million people out
Yeah.
to dry, but we're not leaving the 42 million people out to dry.
Yeah, we're saying that 75% of people underneath the poverty line get welfare, but 25% of them don't.
Okay.
And
So
we're
the
saying that
vast
UBI
majority of people
Yeah.
have access to
And
welfare.
The
that's,
UBI
again,
goes-
we're
You're
not
saying that the
contesting that.
UBI would
Okay.
get the other
We're
25%.
not contesting the
Alright.
fact that it has
So-
helped 42
So
million.
that's just ignoring the arguments that me and Santi have been making this entire round, specifically from our Greenstein evidence, which says that like because welfare is targeted at people who don't make a lot of income, that's why they're able to actually stay out of poverty. The
Okay.
problem is that what ends up happening is that you give people less money than they're making right now, which actually ends up pushing them back into poverty. Like you're not really giving me a lot of numbers here about how much like a UBI would
Okay.
decrease poverty or how many people would be able to like escape poverty because of a UBI, right? Like the system right now is working pretty well because 42 million people have been prevented from going into poverty every single
Yeah,
year.
and again, we're not contesting that, but we still win the round
You're
we'll
not
talk
contesting.
about in the next speech.
That's fine.
We're just gonna take the last like 40 seconds.
I said that.
All right. So it's simply going to be talking about our case and then their case. All right. Judge, as the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. What we've been telling you this entire round is that right now inflation is at 2%, which every single economist agrees is the optimal number for the economy to grow. At that point, there's no reason to implement this huge policy like a UBI that would just spike inflation. There's absolutely no reason. Then they tell you that welfare is actually bad. But they also don't contest that welfare has prevented 42 million people from falling into poverty every single year. At that point, what you're seeing is that we're the only team that's actually telling you what our policies are doing. They try to tell you that a UBI would somehow save the other 25% of people that aren't being affected by welfare. The problem is that they're ignoring our Greenstein evidence, which we've extended this entire round to tell you that what you would actually see when you implement a UBI and replace welfare is that tens of millions of people would be pushed into poverty because they're actually receiving less money than they're receiving right now. That's extremely problematic at the point where they're trying to tell you that like they're giving you this great utopian world where we somehow save everyone. The problem is that you actually give everyone less money than they're receiving right now from welfare, which means that you're actually leaving people way less off than they are right now. At that point, you're actually seeing that we're saving over 42 million people. Nowhere in this round do they give you any numbers for their statistics. Now let's talk about their case. Again, they're ignoring our Belotra evidence, which tells you specifically that when you see that you try and give people like more financial mobility, you actually incentivize abusers to try and re-entrench their role, and they actually increase violence. That only happens when you implement a UBI, which means that is a unique harm to actually voting affirmative. Then they tell you that like more money into the economy would make the economy better because it circulates. Judge, that's the entire reason why inflation happens, because you see that more money being pushed into the economy when inflation inflation is at a perfectly fine level right now would just spike inflation, which is very problematic, as our case tell you that for the past 4 recessions have all been caused by an inflationary spike. At the point where companies know that people now have more money to spend, they know that they're going to be able to increase prices. That's the entire reason why inflation happens. That's the entire reason why the past 4 recessions have happened.
We have 4 seconds.
Okay, so first I'll talk about their case, and then I'll go back to our case. Is everyone good? Cool. The first main argument they go for is inflation. They just keep repeating the idea that inflation will happen without ever responding to what we said in our speeches. First, remember that because the US is underproducing in its economy currently, even if you inject literally trillions of dollars into the economy, there's no inflation. Empirically, the US literally put $4 trillion into the economy and inflation never went up. And in Alaska, in Kuwait, in literally every place that has done a universal basic income, inflation did not go up. They try to talk about recessions, but inflation doesn't go up, which means they don't access the idea of a recession. The second main thing they go for is the idea that welfare helps people get out of poverty. They just keep repeating this idea that 42 million people get out of poverty because of SNAP, and that if you refer, people are receiving less money. The problem is, they never respond to the Tracy evidence that says that literally 1/4 of people who are poor and should be able to get welfare aren't, because there's so many hoops to jump through and so many requirements to meet that they literally just can't get it. And they never respond to the fact that in 99% of America, SNAP, even at its maximum benefits, is not enough to afford a low-income meal. We're not contesting the fact that 42 million people might have been helped by this program. We're saying that SNAP could be much, much better and reach many more people, literally tens of millions of more people. Instead, we should have a UBI which goes to everybody, regardless of any status they have, and gives them $1,000 every single month to buy things like food. It's very simple. Then, why do you vote for us? Really quickly, at the top, they talk about domestic violence and how people use the UBI to entrench violence. The problem is they never explain why the same thing cannot happen with welfare, which means that in both worlds, domestic violence does not go up or down, it does not change. It should not be a factor into your decision at the end of the day. The reason why you're voting for us is on our third contention about the economy. This is basically not responded to in his last speech. The core of the idea is that when you have more people with money in their pockets, they buy things like food, medical expenses, etc. That boosts the economy, it creates millions of jobs, which is why the Matthews evidence says you increase GDP by 13%, you create 4.7 million jobs and you reduce poverty. He says if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We would say the welfare system is pretty broken. Literally tens of millions of people can't get welfare right now who are literally on the poverty line. The easiest thing you could do to grow the economy and improve the quality of life in America is just put $1,000 a month into every single American's $1,000 a month into every American's pocket. That's why you vote F.
Thank you for judging.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.